The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Veterans Affairs Medical Center cast everything in harsh clinical white. Sarah Chen moved through the empty rehabilitation wing at 5:47 a.m., her sneakers making soft squeaks against the polished linoleum. The building held that particular stillness that only comes in the hour before dawn, when even the most dedicated staff hadn't yet arrived. She preferred it this way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the quiet, she could work without the weight of sideways glances and whispered comments that followed her through most days. Her key card beeped as she unlocked the supply closet, a space most of her colleagues treated like a chaotic dumping ground. Sarah saw it differently. Every resistance band had its designated hook. Exercise weights were arranged by increments, not just tossed onto shelves. The ultrasound gel tubes were organized by expiration date, with the oldest rotated to the front. She didn't do this because anyone asked her to. She did it because chaos in a medical environment could cost someone their recovery, their hope, or worse. Sarah's morning routine had become a meditation of sorts. She would arrive 90 minutes before her official start time, not because she was required to, but because the veterans deserved equipment that worked properly and therapy sessions that began on schedule. She tested each machine, checked the calibration on the weight systems, and ensured that the parallel bars were stable and level. These details mattered in ways that her supervisor, Marcus Thompson, never seemed to grasp. Marcus was the kind of man who spoke loudly about his weekend golf games and made jokes about government efficiency while standing in a government building. He had been running the physical therapy department for 8 years, long enough to develop the casual arrogance that comes with never being seriously challenged. When he looked at Sarah, he saw exactly what he expected to see: a young woman who had probably exaggerated her qualifications to get hired. Someone who claimed military experience, but clearly didn't understand what real service looked like. The assumption had started on her first day, 6 months ago, when Marcus had glanced at her application during their brief orientation meeting. "Says here you have military experience," he had said, not quite making it a question, but not quite accepting it as fact either. "What branch?" "Army," Sarah had replied simply. "Stateside?" She had hesitated for just a moment, the kind of pause that people who had never been deployed might interpret as uncertainty, rather than the careful consideration of someone deciding how much truth to share. "Overseas," she had said finally. Marcus had nodded with the expression of someone filing away information for later use. He hadn't asked for details, and Sarah hadn't offered them. That conversation had set the tone for everything that followed. To Marcus and most of the staff, she was probably one of those people who had served a desk job in Germany, or maybe spent a few months at a safe base in Kuwait, then came home and called herself a veteran. Danny Rodriguez, the senior physical therapy aide, had been more direct in his skepticism. Danny was a large man with thick forearms and a habit of wearing tight polo shirts that showed off his gym routine. He had never served in the military himself, but he had strong opinions about who deserved the title of soldier and who didn't. He had served as an EMT for 12 years before joining the VA, and he wore that experience like a badge of honor, often mentioning how he had seen real action on the streets of Cleveland. "You know what I can't stand?" Danny had said one afternoon about 3 weeks into Sarah's employment, speaking loudly enough for her to hear while she organized therapy schedules nearby. "People who claim they're veterans when they probably never left some air-conditioned office on base. Real soldiers don't hide what they did. They're proud of their service." The comment had been meant for Sarah, though Danny had the social intelligence to direct it toward Linda Foster, the receptionist, who nodded along with most things people said to avoid workplace conflict. Sarah had continued sorting appointment cards, her expression unchanged, but her movements had become slightly more deliberate, the way they did when she was managing something internal. This pattern had continued for months. Danny would make comments about fake soldiers and stolen valor whenever Sarah was within earshot. He never accused her directly, maintaining the plausible deniability of someone who claimed he was just speaking, generally about a problem he had heard about on the news. Marcus would occasionally join in with observations about how the hiring process didn't properly verify military credentials, or how some people seemed to think that wearing a uniform for a few months made them warriors. Sarah absorbed these comments the way she absorbed most forms of discomfort, silently, completely, filing them away in a place where they couldn't interfere with her work. She had learned long ago that defending herself often caused more problems than it solved, and that the truth had a way of revealing itself when it mattered most. Her job was to help veterans regain their strength and mobility. Everything else was noise. The treatment rooms at the VA were small institutional spaces with beige walls and motivational posters that someone in administration thought would inspire hope. Sarah had memorized every crack in the ceiling tiles and every stain on the carpeting. She knew which examination tables had wheels that stuck and which electrical outlets were unreliable. She knew these things because she paid attention to details that others overlooked, the same way she noticed that Mr. Patterson in room 3 always gripped his left shoulder when he thought no one was looking, or that Ms. Williams had been favoring her right leg more heavily over the past 2 weeks. Her patient notes were meticulous, filled with observations that went beyond the standard measurements of range of motion and pain levels. She tracked patterns, emotional responses, subtle changes in gait or posture that might indicate underlying issues. When she tried to share these insights with Marcus during their weekly meetings, he would nod politely and then file her reports in a folder that she suspected he never opened. "Sarah's very thorough," he would say when other staff members asked about her work, using the tone that made thorough sound like a gentle criticism rather than a compliment. "Sometimes I think she overthinks things, but the veterans seem to like her." They did like her, though Sarah herself wasn't entirely sure why. She didn't make small talk the way Danny did, regaling patients with stories about his days or his opinions about local sports teams. She didn't have Marcus's booming, artificially cheerful bedside manner. What she offered instead was something harder to define, a quality of attention that made people feel genuinely seen and heard. When Tommy Barnes, a 24-year-old Marine who had lost his left leg to an IED in Syria, struggled with the emotional aspects of learning to walk with a prosthetic, Sarah would work with him in patient silence, adjusting equipment and offering encouragement without the forced optimism that many medical professionals defaulted to. When Mrs. Chen, a Korean War veteran's widow who came in for chronic pain management, needed someone to listen to stories about her late husband, Sarah would continue her therapy work while maintaining the kind of focused attention that conveyed respect rather than mere politeness. The veterans sensed something in Sarah that the staff either couldn't see or chose to ignore. They would request her specifically for their appointments when possible, and several had mentioned to the front desk that she seemed to understand things about their experience that other therapists missed. Linda Foster had passed these comments along to Marcus, who had dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Veterans always think other veterans understand them better," he had said. "It's natural they'd gravitate towards Sarah if they think she served. Doesn't mean she's necessarily better at the job." The implication was clear. Sarah's effectiveness with patients was based on a misunderstanding, possibly even a deception. If the veterans knew the truth about her limited military experience, Marcus seemed to believe, they might not be so eager to work with her. Sarah kept her sleeves rolled down even in summer. The VA building's air conditioning was unreliable, and the physical therapy wing could become uncomfortably warm during busy afternoon sessions, but she never removed her cardigan or rolled up the sleeves of her scrubs. Her colleagues assumed this was a personal preference, maybe sensitivity to cold, or simply a conservative approach to workplace attire. They had no way of knowing that she was covering a tattoo that would have immediately ended all speculation about her military background. The tattoo was located on her upper left forearm, positioned where it would be visible in short sleeves, but easily concealed by long ones. It was not large or flashy, executed in simple black ink with clean lines and precise detail. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The central image was a medical caduceus, the traditional symbol of healthcare, but intertwined with the wings and snake in a way that only certain people would recognize. Beneath the caduceus were the numbers 68W, the military occupational specialty code for Army Combat Medic, and below that, in smaller script, were two sets of dates that marked deployments most people would never fully understand. The tattoo had been done by a former Navy corpsman who ran a shop near Fort Campbell, Kentucky, someone who understood the significance of every element and had refused payment from Sarah when she explained what the dates represented. It was not the kind of tattoo that someone got for aesthetic reasons or to impress civilians. It was a mark of belonging to a community that most people could only imagine, a symbol that carried weight and responsibility and memories that Sarah carried with her every day. She had considered having it removed several times since starting work at the VA, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had learned that sometimes the truth was more complicated than people were prepared to handle. Her experience in Afghanistan had left her with physical and emotional scars that she managed privately, and she had discovered that talking about combat medicine often led to questions she wasn't ready to answer and conversations she didn't want to have. The decision to keep her military experience private hadn't been made out of deception, but out of self-preservation. Sarah had tried being open about her background at her previous job, a civilian physical therapy clinic in Columbus, and the experience had been exhausting. Well-meaning colleagues would ask her to share war stories during lunch breaks, or they would make assumptions about her political views based on her military service. Some would treat her with an uncomfortable deference, as if her deployment made her opinions more valuable than theirs. Others would become defensive, feeling the need to justify their own civilian experiences or explain why they hadn't served. Worst of all were the people who wanted to use her experience for their own purposes, who would bring up her military background during workplace conflicts as if it gave their arguments more weight, or who would make comments about how she must be tough enough to handle difficult situations because she had been a soldier. Sarah had learned that for many civilians, veterans existed more as symbols than as complex human beings, and she had grown tired of being asked to perform the role of either hero or victim, depending on what the situation seemed to require. At the VA, she had hoped things might be different. Working with veterans, she had thought, might mean working with people who understood that military service was just one part of a person's identity, not a defining characteristic that explained everything about them. But the VA was staffed primarily by civilians, and many of them had their own complicated relationships with military culture that made Sarah's situation even more delicate. Marcus, for instance, had never served but had grown up in a military family and carried some resentment about the pressure he had felt to enlist after high school. He had chosen college instead, a decision he clearly still felt defensive about, and he seemed to view veterans with a mixture of respect and skepticism that made him quick to question anyone's military credentials. Danny had applied to join the Marines after high school but had been rejected due to a minor heart condition, a disappointment that had shaped his strong opinions about what constituted real military service. In this environment, Sarah had calculated that revealing her combat experience would create more problems than it solved. She would either face skepticism about the extent of her service, unwanted attention and questions about her deployments, or expectations that she couldn't or didn't want to meet. It seemed simpler to let people make their assumptions and focus on doing her job well, But simplicity had come with its own costs. The constant undercurrent of doubt about her credibility was wearing, especially when it affected how her colleagues viewed her professional capabilities. Sarah knew that she was good at her job, not just because of her military training, but because she had natural instincts for patient care and had worked hard to develop her civilian medical skills. But in an environment where her expertise was constantly questioned, it became difficult to advocate for her patients when she disagreed with treatment decisions or to suggest improvements to department procedures when her input was viewed with suspicion. The morning routine that had become so important to her was partly about ensuring that her work spoke for itself. If the equipment was properly maintained and the therapy sessions ran smoothly, then her competence was undeniable regardless of what people thought about her background. If the veterans made progress and felt supported during their recovery, then the quality of her care was evident even if Marcus dismissed it as a result of misplaced veteran solidarity. Sarah had developed a filing system for patient information that was far more comprehensive than what the department required. She tracked not just the standard metrics of recovery, but also emotional indicators, family dynamics, and external factors that might affect a patient's progress. She had created exercise modification protocols for patients with specific types of combat injuries, drawing on her understanding of battlefield trauma to develop rehabilitation approaches that addressed both physical and psychological aspects of recovery. None of this innovation was officially recognized or incorporated into department policy. Marcus preferred to stick with established protocols, and he viewed Sarah's additional documentation as unnecessary complication rather than valuable insight. But the veterans themselves noticed the difference in their care, even if they couldn't always articulate what made their sessions with Sarah more effective than their experiences with other therapists. Tommy Barnes had been struggling with phantom pain and depression since losing his leg, resistant to the standard approaches that focused purely on physical adaptation to his prosthetic. Sarah had recognized signs of survivor guilt and self-blame. That reminded her of patterns she had observed in wounded soldiers during her deployment. She had modified his therapy routine to include exercises that rebuilt not just physical strength, but also confidence and sense of control. And she had connected him with a veteran peer counselor without making the referral feel like an admission of weakness. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had been exposed to Agent Orange during his service in Vietnam, was dealing with her own health issues while caring for him in his final illness. Sarah had noticed that her chronic pain was worsening during particularly stressful periods of her husband's decline, and she had worked with the social worker to arrange additional support services while adapting her physical therapy to account for the emotional burden she was carrying. These interventions went beyond the scope of what was typically expected from a physical therapy assistant, but they reflected Sarah's understanding that veteran health issues were often complicated by factors that purely medical approaches couldn't address. Her ability to recognize and respond to these complexities came partly from her professional training, but mostly from her personal experience with the challenges of military service and the transition back to civilian life. She kept detailed notes on all of these cases, documentation that would have been valuable for training other staff members or developing better treatment protocols for veteran patients. But she had learned not to push too hard for these insights to be heard. Marcus was already suspicious of her motivations, and being too assertive about treatment recommendations might only reinforce his belief that she was overstepping her qualifications. Instead, Sarah focused on building trust with individual patients and making incremental improvements in their care that might not be noticed by administration but that made a real difference in the lives of the veterans she served. It was quiet work, often invisible work, but it was the kind of service that she had learned to value during her time in Afghanistan, where the most important victories were often the ones that prevented disasters rather than the ones that made headlines. The irony was not lost on her that she was once again serving in a context where her most significant contributions were likely to go unrecognized, where the people who benefited from her expertise had no idea of the full extent of her qualifications, and where those in authority positions viewed her with a skepticism that might evaporate if they knew the truth about her background. But Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in external recognition, and she had made peace with the idea that doing her job well was more important than being understood or appreciated by her colleagues. At least, she had thought she had made peace with it, until the morning when everything changed. The coffee machine in the break room made a grinding sound that had been getting progressively worse for 3 weeks. Sarah had mentioned it to Marcus twice, explaining that the veterans often relied on their morning coffee as part of their routine, especially those dealing with chronic pain who arrived for early appointments. Marcus had nodded each time and promised to submit a maintenance request, but the machine continued to struggle through each brew cycle, occasionally producing cups that were more lukewarm water than actual coffee. On Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived, to find the machine completely silent. She tried the power button several times before accepting that it had finally given up entirely. Rather than wait for the official repair process, which could take weeks given the bureaucratic pace of VM maintenance requests, she had driven to a nearby electronics store during her lunch break and purchased a replacement with her own money. Not an expensive model, but something reliable that would consistently produce hot coffee for people who often had limited control over other aspects of their daily experience. She had installed the new machine without fanfare, leaving the receipt tucked under the base in case anyone asked questions about procurement procedures. When Danny discovered the replacement that afternoon, he had been initially pleased, assuming that the VA had finally responded to the maintenance request. Sarah hadn't corrected his assumption, but Marcus had noticed the model number and realized that the machine was too new and too nice to be standard government issue. During the following week's staff meeting, he had brought up the importance of following proper channels for equipment purchases, reminding everyone that accepting unauthorized donations could create liability issues and that staff members shouldn't feel obligated to spend their personal money on workplace improvements. Sarah had sat quietly during this lecture, understanding that it was directed at her even though Marcus never mentioned her name or the coffee machine specifically. The message was clear. Her initiative was unwelcome, possibly inappropriate, and definitely outside the boundaries of her role as a physical therapy assistant. Danny had been more direct in his criticism. "You know what bothers me about people who try to be heroes," he had said later that week, ostensibly speaking to Linda but clearly intending for Sarah to hear. "They make the rest of us look bad. Like we don't care enough to spend our own money fixing things. It's manipulative." The accusation stung more than Sarah cared to admit, partly because she recognized a grain of truth in it. She did feel frustrated by the inefficiencies and neglect that affected veteran care, and she did sometimes spend her own resources to address problems that others ignored. But her motivation wasn't to make colleagues look bad or to position herself as more dedicated than others. It came from a deeper place, connected to promises she had made to herself during her deployment about always putting the needs of wounded service members first. In Afghanistan, Sarah had learned that the difference between life and death often came down to small details and split-second decisions. A properly maintained piece of medical equipment could save someone's life. A moment of inattention or a missing supply could cost someone their future. She had seen what happened when systems failed and when people didn't take responsibility for the tools and procedures they depended on. Those lessons didn't automatically translate to a civilian medical environment, where the stakes were usually lower and the pace was more forgiving. But Sarah found it difficult to adjust her standards or her sense of responsibility. When she saw a problem that affected patient care, her instinct was to fix it immediately rather than wait for someone else to notice and respond through official channels. This approach had created a pattern of tension with her colleagues. They viewed her initiatives as implicit criticism of their own work habits, while she experienced their resistance as indifference to patient welfare. Neither interpretation was entirely fair, but the dynamic had become entrenched over the months she had been working at the VA. The situation was complicated by the fact that Sarah's interventions were often effective and always well-intentioned. The new coffee machine did improve the morning experience for veterans and staff alike. Her reorganization of the supply closet had made equipment easier to find and reduced the time spent searching for specific items. Her detailed patient notes had helped identify potential complications before they became serious problems. But in a workplace where hierarchy and procedure were important, effectiveness wasn't always enough to justify initiative. Marcus had been managing the department for years without major incidents, and he interpreted Sarah's improvements as suggestions that his leadership was inadequate. Danny had been working with veterans for over a decade, and he read her insights as implications that his experience was insufficient. Sarah began to understand that her competence was creating political problems that she hadn't anticipated. In the military, initiative and attention to detail were generally valued, even when they came from lower-ranking personnel. In the civilian world, those same qualities could be perceived as insubordination or grandstanding, especially when they came from someone whose credibility was already questioned. She started to pull back, limiting her initiatives to changes that were too small to notice or too obviously beneficial to criticize. She still arrived early and stayed late, but she was more careful about which problems she addressed and how she addressed them. She continued to take detailed notes on her patients, but she shared fewer insights during staff meetings and was less persistent when her recommendations were dismissed. This strategic retreat was emotionally exhausting. Sarah felt like she was constantly calculating the political implications of basic professional decisions, weighing whether advocating for a patient's needs was worth the potential conflict with colleagues. She found herself second-guessing instincts that had served her well in high-stakes medical situations, hesitating before speaking up about issues that could affect patient outcomes. The veterans noticed the change, though they couldn't identify exactly what was different. Tommy Barnes mentioned during one session that Sarah seemed more tired lately, more reserved. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if everything was okay at home, sensing a distance that hadn't been there before. Several patients commented to Linda that Sarah seemed less engaged, though they were quick to add that she was still their preferred therapist. Linda passed these observations along to Marcus, who interpreted them as evidence that Sarah was struggling with the demands of her position. "Some people just aren't cut out for the long term," he told Danny during one of their regular conversations about staffing issues. Maybe she's realizing that working with veterans requires a different kind of stamina than she expected. Danny agreed, adding his own theory that Sarah might be dealing with guilt about her limited military experience. "It's gotta be hard, pretending to understand what these guys went through when you probably never left some cushy base somewhere. Eventually that catches up with you." These conversations, which took place within earshot of other staff members, gradually created a narrative about Sarah's declining performance and questionable commitment. The story wasn't entirely inaccurate, since Sarah was indeed pulling back from some of her previous initiatives, but it missed the underlying reasons for the change and attributed her behavior to personal failings rather than workplace dynamics. Sarah became aware of this narrative when Linda mentioned, with genuine concern, that some people were worried about whether she was happy in her position. Linda was trying to be helpful, but her warning made it clear that Sarah's job security might be at risk if she couldn't find a way to navigate the political landscape more successfully. The realization forced Sarah to confront a dilemma she had been avoiding. She could continue to hide her military background and try to rebuild her standing through careful political maneuvering, accepting that her effectiveness would be limited by her colleagues' assumptions about her qualifications. Or she could reveal the truth about her service and risk the complicated consequences that might follow. Neither option was appealing. The political approach felt like a betrayal of the Pavale veterans she served, forcing her to prioritize workplace harmony over patient advocacy. But disclosure felt like a betrayal of herself, requiring her to expose experiences she had worked hard to process privately, and to submit to scrutiny from people who had no framework for understanding what she had been through. Sarah decided to try a middle path, looking for ways to demonstrate her competence without directly challenging the assumptions about her background. She began documenting her work more carefully, creating detailed case studies that showed the effectiveness of her treatment approaches without explicitly referencing her military training. She started building alliances with individual patients and their families, hoping that their advocacy might carry more weight than her own. The strategy had mixed results. Her documentation was thorough and impressive, but Marcus seemed to view it as evidence of overthinking rather than clinical insight. The veteran patients and their families did speak highly of her work, but their praise was often dismissed as the natural bonding that occurred between veterans and anyone who showed understanding of military culture. More problematically, Sarah's careful political approach was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. The constant self-monitoring and strategic thinking required to navigate workplace relationships left her with less emotional energy for patient care. She found herself going through the motions during therapy sessions, providing competent but uninspired treatment that met basic standards without reaching the level of excellence she had previously achieved. The decline was gradual enough that it might have gone unnoticed if not for a new patient who arrived in early November. James Mitchell was a 43-year-old Army veteran who had served 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before being medically retired due to injuries sustained in an IED explosion. He was dealing with chronic pain, mobility issues, and PTSD symptoms that made it difficult for him to trust medical professionals or engage consistently with treatment. James had a reputation among VA staff as a difficult patient. He was often late for appointments, skeptical of treatment recommendations, and prone to emotional outbursts when he felt misunderstood or dismissed. Previous therapists had struggled to establish rapport with him, and several had requested that he be transferred to other providers after particularly challenging sessions. Marcus assigned James to Sarah partly because her schedule had an opening, but also because he was curious to see how she would handle a genuinely difficult case. If she succeeded, it would validate his decision to keep her on staff, despite concerns about her recent performance. If she struggled, it would provide evidence that she wasn't as effective with veterans as some people believed. Sarah's first session with James was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-November. She had reviewed his file carefully, noting the complexity of his injuries and the pattern of unsuccessful treatment attempts. She understood that building trust would be crucial, and that any approach that felt patronizing or overly clinical would likely trigger his defensive responses. When James arrived 15 minutes late for their appointment, he was clearly agitated. He had been stuck in traffic due to construction on the highway, and the delay had activated anxiety symptoms that made it difficult for him to focus on anything other than his frustration with the situation. He apologized for being late with an edge in his voice that suggested he expected to be criticized or dismissed. Sarah responded by acknowledging that traffic delays were frustrating and offering to adjust the session to accommodate the lost time. She didn't lecture him about the importance of punctuality or suggest that he should have allowed more travel time, responses that James had received from other providers and that had immediately put him on the defensive. Instead, she asked if he needed a few minutes to settle in before they began, recognizing that jumping immediately into physical exercises might not be effective given his current emotional state. The question caught James off guard, since most medical professionals seemed eager to maximize every minute of appointment time, regardless of his readiness to participate. They spent the first part of the session talking about his goals for physical therapy and his previous experiences with treatment. James was initially guarded, giving brief answers and watching Sarah carefully for signs of judgment or impatience. But as she listened without interrupting and asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest in his perspective, he began to open up about his frustrations with the medical system and his doubts about whether physical therapy could really help him. Sarah found herself responding to James with an authenticity that she hadn't felt in months of careful workplace navigation. His experiences with bureaucratic inefficiency and his feelings of being misunderstood by civilian medical providers resonated with her own struggles, both during her deployment and in her current position. She didn't share these connections explicitly, but they informed her responses in ways that James seemed to recognize and appreciate. By the end of their first session, James had agreed to a treatment plan and scheduled his next appointment without the resistance that had characterized his interactions with previous therapists. He mentioned to Linda on his way out that Sarah seemed different from other VA staff, though he couldn't quite articulate what made the difference. Over the following weeks, Sarah's work with James became a highlight of her schedule. He was challenging in the way that she remembered from her most rewarding cases in Afghanistan, requiring her to think creatively and respond flexibly to changing circumstances. His progress was gradual but consistent, and more importantly, he was beginning to engage with his recovery in a way that suggested genuine hope for improvement. The success with James reminded Sarah of why she had wanted to work at the VA in the first place and reconnected her with the sense of purpose that had been dimmed by months of political maneuvering. She found herself investing more fully in all of her patient relationships, drawing on insights and instincts that she had been suppressing in her efforts to avoid workplace conflict. The renewed energy and effectiveness in her work was noticeable to both patients and colleagues. Tommy Barnes commented that Sarah seemed more like herself again, more present and engaged during their sessions. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her pain seemed more manageable when she worked with Sarah, though she couldn't explain exactly why. The sessions were more helpful. Even Marcus noticed the improvement, though he attributed it to Sarah finally settling into her role, rather than recognizing it as a return to her natural level of competence. Danny remained skeptical, suggesting that Sarah was probably just putting extra effort into impressing everyone because she knew her performance had been questioned. But the renewed confidence and effectiveness also made Sarah less willing to accept the limitations that workplace politics had imposed on her patient advocacy. When she disagreed with treatment decisions or saw opportunities for improvement in department procedures, she found it increasingly difficult to remain silent. In the interest of maintaining harmony with colleagues, the tension came to a head during a staff meeting in early December, when Marcus announced new efficiency targets that would reduce the time allocated for individual therapy sessions. The changes were being implemented in response to budget pressures and would require therapists to see more patients per day while spending less time with each one. Sarah understood the financial realities behind the decision, but she also knew that the reduced session times would disproportionately affect patients like James, who needed additional time to build trust and engage effectively with treatment. She had spent months watching colleagues dismiss veteran concerns and attribute treatment failures to patient resistance rather than examining whether their approaches were appropriate for people dealing with combat trauma. When Marcus asked for questions about the new scheduling requirements, Sarah raised her hand and asked whether accommodations could be made for patients with complex trauma histories who might need longer sessions to make meaningful progress. The question was reasonable and professionally phrased, but it was also a direct challenge to the efficiency model that Marcus was trying to implement. Marcus responded with visible irritation, explaining that exceptions to scheduling standards would create inequities and administrative complications that the department couldn't manage. He added that effective therapists should be able to achieve results within the allocated timeframes, and that patients who couldn't adapt to standard procedures might need to be referred to specialized programs outside the VA system. The response revealed an attitude toward veteran care that Sarah found deeply troubling. The implication that patients who struggled with standard approaches were problems to be transferred rather than challenges to be addressed ran counter to everything she believed about medical treatment and military service obligations. She found herself speaking before she had fully considered the consequences. Some of these patients, she said, have been through experiences that don't fit into standard treatment models. Maybe we need to adapt our approaches instead of expecting them to adapt to our convenience. The room fell silent. Danny stared at her with obvious displeasure, while Linda looked uncomfortable with the tension that had suddenly filled the space. Marcus's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to anger. "Sarah," he said with forced calm, "I appreciate your concern for our patients. But you need to understand that we have to work within the constraints of the system. We're part of. Making exceptions for every patient who claims special circumstances would make it impossible to serve the broader veteran population effectively." The phrase "claims special circumstances" hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized that Marcus wasn't just defending his scheduling policy. He was questioning whether veteran trauma was legitimate or whether patients were exaggerating their symptoms to receive preferential treatment. She felt something shift inside her, a recognition that staying silent was no longer possible regardless of the professional consequences. The veterans she served deserved advocates who understood what they had been through and who were willing to fight for appropriate care, even when it was inconvenient or complicated. "With respect," Sarah said, standing up from her chair, "these aren't special circumstances. They're the normal consequences of combat service. And if we can't provide appropriate care for combat veterans at a medical center, then we're failing in our basic mission." The words came out with more force than she had intended, carrying months of suppressed frustration and an authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. For a moment, Sarah sounded like someone who spoke from experience rather than assumption, someone who understood combat trauma from the inside rather than from textbooks and training seminars. Marcus stared at her for several seconds, clearly struggling to process this sudden assertiveness from someone he had categorized as deferential and possibly unqualified. When he spoke, his voice carried a coldness that made it clear the conversation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I think," he said slowly, "that you may be overestimating your expertise in this area. Sarah, combat trauma is a complex field that requires specialized training and experience. Perhaps you should focus on the physical therapy techniques you were hired to provide, and leave the psychological assessments to qualified professionals." The dismissal was calculated to remind Sarah of her place in the department hierarchy, and to suggest that her opinions about veteran care were based on presumption rather than knowledge. But it also revealed Marcus's own assumptions about her background and his belief that she lacked the credentials to speak authoritatively about military trauma. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, seeing in their faces a mixture of discomfort, curiosity, and judgment. She realized that she had reached a decision point that she had been avoiding for months. She could apologize and retreat, accepting Marcus's characterization of her as someone who had overstepped her qualifications. Or she could reveal the truth about her background and deal with whatever consequences followed. The choice wasn't really about her own comfort or career prospects anymore. It was about whether she was willing to continue working in an environment that dismissed veteran trauma and whether she could advocate effectively for her patients while hiding the experiences that gave her insights into their struggles. Sarah rolled up her left sleeve. The tattoo emerged like a revelation written in black ink against Sarah's pale skin. The medical caduceus was immediately recognizable, but it was the wings intertwined with the serpent that made Danny's coffee cup pause halfway to his lips. The numbers 68W stood out in crisp military font beneath the symbol, followed by two sets of dates that anyone with military knowledge would understand represented deployment periods. Below those, in smaller script, were the words Helmand, Province, and FOB shank. Marcus stared at the exposed forearm, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching shock. The silence in the break room stretched uncomfortably as the implications of what they were seeing settled over the assembled staff. Linda's hand moved unconsciously to cover her mouth, while Danny set his cup down with a clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. James Mitchell had been passing by the break room on his way to his appointment when he heard the raised voices through the partially open door. He had paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but recognizing the tone of institutional conflict that had become familiar during his years of dealing with VA bureaucracy. He was about to continue walking when he caught sight of Sarah's exposed tattoo through the doorway. The effect on James was immediate and profound. His face went pale, not with shock, but with recognition and something deeper, a mixture of respect, understanding, and perhaps relief. He stepped into the doorway, his eyes fixed on the tattoo with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. "Combat medic," James said quietly, his voice carrying into the silent room. 68 whiskey, those dates. He paused, calculating quickly. "You were at Shank during the surge. That was heavy fighting." Sarah met his eyes across the room, seeing in them the recognition she had been both hoping for and dreading. James understood not just what the tattoo meant, but what the experiences it represented had cost her. He knew why she might choose to keep that history private, and why revealing it now felt like both a relief and a vulnerability. "You were there," Sarah said simply, not quite a question. "Different unit, same EO," James replied, using the military abbreviation for area of operations with the casual fluency of someone for whom such language was still natural. "I heard about the medics at Shank. You guys saved a lot of lives." The conversation was happening in a kind of military shorthand that excluded the civilian staff members, who found themselves suddenly aware of how little they understood about the world their patients came from. Marcus looked between Sarah and James with growing discomfort, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted in ways he couldn't control or predict. Danny was the first to find his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. You actually served in combat?" The question carried an undertone of disbelief that made Sarah's jaw tighten slightly. Even faced with documentary evidence in the form of her tattoo, Danny seemed unable to fully process the contradiction between his assumptions about her and the reality of her experience. "2 deployments," Sarah said, her voice steady but with an edge that hadn't been there before. 14 months total. Forward operating bases and combat outposts, providing medical support to infantry units. James nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Combat medics don't get that ink unless they've been under fire. It's not something you can fake or buy your way into." The statement was directed at the room in general, but its implication was clear. James was vouching for Sarah's credentials in a way that carried weight with anyone who understood military culture. He was also, subtly but unmistakably, calling out the skepticism that had characterized her colleagues' treatment of her. Marcus cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond what he had anticipated when he questioned Sarah's expertise. "Well," he said slowly, "I think we can all agree that this changes the context of our discussion somewhat." The understatement was so massive that it bordered on absurd. Sarah had just revealed that she was exactly the kind of medical professional that the VA was supposed to prioritize in hiring. Someone with direct experience treating combat injuries under the most challenging possible circumstances. Everything that Marcus and Danny had assumed about her qualifications and motivations had been wrong, and their treatment of her over the past months now appeared not just unfair, but actively harmful to veteran care. Sarah rolled her sleeve back, down, covering the tattoo but not the knowledge it had revealed. The gesture was deliberate, a signal that she wasn't interested in making a spectacle of her military service. or using it to score points in workplace conflicts. She had revealed her background out of necessity, to establish her credibility in advocating for appropriate veteran care, not to seek special treatment or recognition. The scheduling changes, she said, returning to the original topic of discussion. With a focus that made it clear she considered the matter far from settled. Reducing session times for patients with complex trauma histories isn't just inefficient, it's potentially harmful. Some of these veterans need additional time to build trust before they can engage effectively with treatment. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. Agreeing with Sarah's assessment would require acknowledging that his efficiency-focused approach was inadequate, but dismissing the concerns of a combat veteran about veteran care would be professionally and politically untenable. He looked around the room as if hoping someone else would provide guidance for navigating this unexpected situation. James stepped further into the room, his presence adding weight to Sarah's arguments in ways that made the civilian staff members acutely aware of their outsider status in discussions about veteran care. "She's right," he said simply. "Most of the therapists I've worked with here don't understand why certain things are triggers or why building trust takes time. Sarah gets it because she's been there." The endorsement was powerful not just because of James's status as a veteran, but because of his reputation as a difficult patient who rarely praised via staff members. His willingness to speak positively about Sarah's approach carried implications that extended far beyond their individual therapeutic relationship. Linda, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I'm sorry. We had no idea about your background, some of the things that were said." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with acknowledging the extent of the skepticism and criticism that had been directed at Sarah over the past months. Danny remained silent, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. His comments about fake soldiers and stolen valor now seemed not just wrong but cruel, particularly given that they had been directed at someone whose service record likely exceeded his own understanding of what military commitment entailed. Sarah recognized that the revelation of her military background had created an opportunity to address systemic issues in veteran care that went beyond her individual situation. The moment called for leadership that could transform a personal vindication into broader improvements for all veterans receiving treatment at the facility. "This isn't about my credentials," she said, addressing the room but looking primarily at Marcus. "It's about whether we're providing appropriate care for people who've served in combat. The veterans I work with here are dealing with injuries and trauma that require specialized understanding and flexible treatment approaches." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The efficiency model you're proposing assumes that all patients respond to standardized treatment protocols. But combat veterans often need time to process emotions, manage triggers, and build trust before they can engage fully with physical therapy. Rushing those processes doesn't save time. It leads to treatment failures and patients dropping out of care entirely." James nodded emphatically. "I went through 4 different therapists before Sarah because nobody understood why I couldn't just focus on the exercises. They kept telling me to leave my military experience outside the treatment room, like it was something separate from my injuries." The comment highlighted a fundamental misunderstanding that characterized much of civilian-provided veteran care. The assumption that military service was background information rather than central context for understanding veteran health issues reflected a compartmentalized view of human experience that ignored the integrated nature of physical and psychological trauma. Sarah recognized an opportunity to educate her colleagues while advocating for policy changes that would benefit all veteran patients. "Combat injuries aren't just physical," she explained. "When someone loses a limb to an IED, they're not just dealing with amputation. They're processing survivor guilt, questioning their identity, grieving their lost capabilities, and often struggling with trust issues related to their vulnerability. She gestured toward James, who had agreed to participate in the discussion by remaining in the room. Physical therapy for combat veterans has to address all of those factors, not just the mechanical aspects of rehabilitation. That requires time, patience, and understanding that goes beyond standard civilian training. Marcus was clearly struggling with the implications of Sarah's expertise and advocacy. Accepting her arguments would require acknowledging that his department's approach to veteran care was inadequate and that he had been dismissing valuable insights from someone uniquely qualified to provide them. But resisting her recommendations now would appear to prioritize administrative convenience over veteran welfare, a position that would be difficult to defend. "What are you proposing specifically?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting grudging acceptance that the conversation had moved beyond his control. Sarah had clearly given this question considerable thought, drawing on months of observation and her own experience with effective combat medical care. Flexible scheduling for complex trauma cases with session lengths determined by therapeutic need rather than administrative efficiency. Training for all staff on combat trauma recognition and response. And regular consultation between physical therapy and mental health services to ensure integrated care. The proposals were reasonable and professionally presented, but they also represented a significant departure from the standardized approach that Marcus preferred. Implementing Sarah's recommendations would require acknowledging that veteran care demanded specialized knowledge and individualized treatment planning, concepts that conflicted with the efficiency-focused model he had been trying to establish. James added his perspective as a patient who had experienced both effective and ineffective treatment approaches. "Sarah's the first therapist who understood that my anger wasn't about the exercises. It was about feeling helpless and misunderstood. Once she addressed that, the physical work became possible." The testimonial provided concrete evidence of the effectiveness of Sarah's approach and highlighted the limitations of standardized treatment protocols for addressing complex trauma presentations. It also demonstrated the kind of therapeutic alliance that was possible when veterans worked with providers who understood their experiences. Danny finally spoke, his voice subdued and somewhat defensive. "I guess I don't understand why you didn't mention your military background when you started working here. It seems like that would have been relevant information." The question contained an implicit criticism, suggesting that Sarah bore some responsibility for the misunderstandings that had characterized her colleagues' treatment of her. But it also revealed the extent to which Danny still didn't grasp the complexity of decisions about disclosure that many veterans faced in civilian workplaces. Sarah considered her response carefully, recognizing an opportunity to educate her colleagues about veteran transition issues while explaining her own choices. "Talking about combat experience is complicated," she said finally. "Some people treat you differently when they know, either as a hero or as someone damaged. Others want you to entertain them with war stories or validate their political opinions." She paused, looking directly at Danny. "And some people assume you're lying or exaggerating because their idea of what a veteran looks like doesn't match what they see. I've learned that it's often easier to let people make their assumptions and focus on doing good work than to deal with all the complications that come with disclosure." The explanation highlighted the double bind that many veterans faced in civilian workplaces. Disclosure of military service could lead to unwanted attention, inappropriate questions, or skepticism about their experiences. But concealing that background could result in missed opportunities for connection and understanding, particularly in environments where military experience was relevant to job performance. James offered his own perspective on the disclosure dilemma. "I tell people I'm a veteran because I need them to understand why certain things are hard for me. But I know other guys who keep it private because they're tired of being seen as broken or dangerous." The comment underscored the individual nature of decisions about military disclosure and the various factors that veterans had to consider when determining how much of their background to share in different contexts. Marcus appeared to be processing the conversation with growing awareness of how little he had understood about veteran culture and the challenges faced by former service members transitioning to civilian careers. His earlier assumptions about Sarah's motivations and qualifications now seemed not just wrong but embarrassingly naive. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to have a broader conversation about how we serve veteran patients and support veteran employees. This discussion has highlighted some gaps in my understanding that probably affect our whole department." The acknowledgement was significant, representing a level of professional humility that Marcus rarely displayed and opening the door for systematic changes in departmental policies and practices. Sarah recognized the opportunity while remaining cautious about Marcus's long-term commitment to reform. "I'd be happy to work with you on developing better practices," she said. "But any changes need to prioritize veteran welfare over administrative convenience, even when that's more complicated or expensive." The statement was both an offer of collaboration and a clear boundary about the principles that would guide Sarah's participation in reform efforts. She was willing to share her expertise and experience, but only in service of genuine improvements in veteran care rather than cosmetic changes designed to address the immediate awkwardness of the situation. James looked at his watch and realized that their impromptu meeting had consumed the time scheduled for his therapy appointment. "Sarah, do you want to reschedule, or do we have time for a quick session?" The question returned the focus to patient care and reminded everyone in the room that the ultimate purpose of their work was serving veterans, rather than managing workplace dynamics. Sarah appreciated the redirection and the implicit statement that her therapeutic relationship with James transcended the administrative complications that had dominated the morning's discussion. "Let's do a session," Sarah said. "We can work on those balance exercises you've been struggling with." As they prepared to leave the break room, James paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembled staff members. "You should know," he said quietly, "that Sarah's the best therapist I've worked with here. Not because she's a veteran, but because she actually listens and understands what we're going through." The endorsement was simple but powerful, cutting through the complexity of military credentials and workplace politics to focus on the quality of care that patients actually received. It also served as a reminder that veteran patients were the ultimate judges of therapeutic effectiveness, regardless of provider background or administrative policies. After Sarah and James left for their therapy session, the remaining staff members sat in uncomfortable silence, processing the implications of what they had learned and witnessed. The morning's events had exposed assumptions, biases, and knowledge gaps that would require significant effort to address. Marcus realized that he needed to fundamentally reconsider his approach to veteran care and his evaluation of staff performance. Sarah's expertise and advocacy had been valuable from the beginning, but he had dismissed them due to his assumptions about her qualifications and his own defensive reactions to suggestions for improvement. Danny faced the more personal challenge of acknowledging that his skepticism about Sarah's military background had been both wrong and harmful. His comments about fake soldiers and stolen valor now appeared not just inaccurate but cruel, particularly given that they had been directed at someone whose service likely exceeded his own understanding of military commitment. Linda, who had been largely neutral in the conflicts between Sarah and her colleagues, found herself reflecting on her own role in perpetuating assumptions and failing to advocate for more respectful treatment of a coworker who had been consistently professional and effective. The revelation of Sarah's combat experience had shifted the dynamic in the physical therapy department in ways that would require ongoing navigation. Her credibility on veteran issues was now unquestionable, but the workplace relationships damaged by months of skepticism and dismissal would take time and effort to repair. More importantly, the morning's events had highlighted systemic issues in veteran care that extended far beyond Sarah's individual situation. The efficiency-focused policies that Marcus had been implementing reflected broader trends in healthcare administration that prioritized standardized treatment protocols over individualized care, particularly for patients with complex trauma histories. Sarah's advocacy for flexible scheduling and specialized training represented a challenge to those trends and an opportunity to demonstrate that veteran-specific approaches could improve both patient outcomes and cost-effectiveness. But implementing such changes would require sustained commitment from leadership and willingness to prioritize veteran welfare over administrative convenience. As Sarah worked with James during their therapy session, she found herself reflecting on the morning's events with mixed emotions. The revelation of her military background had vindicated her expertise and created opportunities for advocacy that had been impossible while her credibility was questioned. But it had also exposed her to new forms of attention and expectation that she wasn't entirely comfortable with. James seemed to understand her ambivalence without needing explicit explanation. "It's weird, isn't it?" he said during a break between exercises. "Finally being seen for who you really are, but also feeling like you've lost some privacy in the process." The observation captured exactly what Sarah was experiencing. The recognition of her expertise was professionally validating and personally satisfying. But it also meant that her military service would now be a constant part of her workplace identity rather than private background information that she could choose whether or not to share. "I'm glad they know," Sarah said after considering his comment, "but I hope it doesn't become the only thing they see when they look at me." James nodded with understanding born of his own experience navigating veteran identity in civilian spaces. "The good news is that you've proven yourself as a therapist first. Your military background just explains why you're so good at it." The perspective was helpful, reminding Sarah that her professional competence had been evident to patients and colleagues alike long before her military credentials were revealed. The morning's events had provided context for her expertise, not created it from nothing. As their session concluded, James made a comment that would stay with Sarah long after he left. "You know what the difference is between you and other therapists I've worked with? You don't act like our problems are inconveniences to be managed. You treat them like challenges to be solved." The distinction highlighted exactly what Sarah hoped to bring to veteran care and what she believed the VA system needed more of. Veterans deserved providers who viewed their complex needs as opportunities for meaningful work rather than obstacles to efficient processing. Walking back toward the main therapy area, Sarah felt a mixture of relief, anxiety, and determination. The morning had changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Her expertise was now recognized, but the work of improving veteran care remained as challenging and important as ever. The difference was that she could now advocate openly for the changes she believed were necessary, drawing on her military experience as a source of credibility rather than hiding it as a potential liability. The day was far from over, and Sarah had several more patients scheduled for the afternoon. But for the first time in months, she felt like she could approach her work with complete authenticity, bringing all of her skills and experience to bear on the challenges faced by the veterans she served. It would take time to rebuild workplace relationships and implement the policy changes she had advocated for, but the foundation had been laid for meaningful progress. Sarah had found her voice as an advocate for veteran care, and her colleagues had been reminded that effective healthcare required understanding the whole person rather than just treating isolated symptoms. As she prepared for her next patient, Sarah rolled up her sleeves deliberately, no longer hiding the tattoo that told part of her story. It felt like a small act of liberation, a decision to be fully present in her work rather than carefully managing others' perceptions of her background and qualifications. The conversation in the break room had been difficult and uncomfortable, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes the truth needed to emerge forcefully in order to create space for the changes that quiet competence alone couldn't achieve. Sarah was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the revelation transformed the physical therapy department in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah noticed the changes first in small gestures, Marcus asking for her input during patient evaluations, Danny making eye contact when they passed in the hallways, Linda including her more naturally in casual conversations. The shift was gradual enough that it might have seemed organic to an outside observer, but Sarah understood that. It represented a fundamental recalibration of workplace relationships that had been built on false assumptions. The most significant change came in the form of a departmental memo that Marcus distributed 3 weeks after their confrontation in the break room. The document, professionally formatted with official via letterhead, announced new protocols for treating veterans with complex trauma histories. The changes included flexible scheduling options, mandatory trauma-informed care training for all staff, and the establishment of regular consultation meetings between physical therapy and mental health services. Sarah read through the memo carefully, noting that many of her specific recommendations had been incorporated almost verbatim. Marcus had given her credit in the document's acknowledgement section, describing her as a valued team member whose expertise has helped us better understand the unique needs of combat veterans. The recognition was professional and appropriate, neither overstating nor minimizing her contributions to the policy development process. But the real test of the new protocols came in their implementation. Sarah watched carefully as her colleagues adjusted to the flexibility requirements, noting who embraced the changes and who remained resistant to deviating from established routines. Marcus surprised her by actively supporting the new approaches, even when they created scheduling complications or required additional time investment from staff members. Danny proved to be the most challenging case. While he no longer made disparaging comments about veteran credentials, he struggled with the individualized treatment approaches that the new protocols required. His EMET background had taught him to value quick decisions and standardized responses, and he found it difficult to slow down and address the emotional components of veteran trauma alongside physical rehabilitation needs. Sarah recognized that Danny's resistance wasn't necessarily about her personally, but reflected broader challenges that civilian medical professionals faced when working with combat veterans. She began offering informal guidance to help him understand veteran psychology and develop more effective therapeutic communication skills. The mentoring relationship that developed between them was awkward at first, given the history of skepticism and criticism that had characterized their previous interactions. But Danny proved to be genuinely committed to improving his patient care, and Sarah's insights helped him connect more effectively with veterans who had previously found him difficult to work with. One afternoon in January, Danny approached Sarah with a question about a patient who had been struggling with anger management during therapy sessions. The veteran, a Marine named Rodriguez who had lost partial vision in an IED explosion, became agitated whenever exercises required him to acknowledge his visual limitations. "I keep trying to explain that accepting his limitations is part of recovery," Danny said, his frustration evident. "But he just gets more angry when I bring it up. Am I missing something?" Sarah recognized the pattern immediately, having worked with similar cases during her deployment. "He's not angry about the limitations," she explained. "He's angry about feeling helpless. In combat, helplessness can be fatal, so his brain is treating visual impairment as a life-threatening vulnerability, rather than a medical condition to manage." She suggested that Danny reframe the exercises as tactical adaptations rather than disability accommodations, helping Rodriguez understand that learning to function with limited vision was a skill development process, similar to other military training rather than an admission of weakness. The approach worked remarkably well. Rodriguez began engaging more positively with his therapy when Danny presented exercises as preparation for operating under adverse conditions, rather than adapting to disability. The change in language might have seemed superficial to civilian observers, but it aligned with Rodriguez's military identity and experience in ways that made the work psychologically acceptable. Danny was amazed by the transformation and began asking Sarah for guidance on other challenging cases. Their collaboration gradually evolved into a genuine partnership, with Danny providing insights about emergency medical procedures while Sarah offered expertise on veteran psychology and trauma-informed care approaches. The success with Rodriguez became a template for addressing similar challenges with other patients. Sarah found herself consulting regularly with colleagues who were struggling to connect with veteran patients or understand their resistance to standard treatment approaches. The consultations were informal and voluntary, but they gradually established Sarah as a resource for veteran-specific care issues throughout the department. Marcus noticed the improvement in patient satisfaction scores and treatment outcomes that coincided with the implementation of Sarah's protocols. Veterans were completing their therapy programs at higher rates, reporting better experiences with care, and demonstrating more significant functional improvements than had been typical under the previous standardized approach. The data provided concrete evidence that individualized, trauma-informed care was not just more humane, but also more effective and cost-efficient than the one-size-fits-all model that Marcus had previously favored. He began presenting the department's outcomes at VA leadership meetings, highlighting the success of their new veteran-focused protocols. Sarah's role in developing and implementing these improvements was recognized formally when Marcus nominated her for the VA's Excellence in Patient Care Award. The nomination process required detailed documentation of her contributions to veteran care, including testimonials from patients and colleagues about the impact of her work. Reading through the testimonials that patients had provided for her nomination, Sarah was struck by how many veterans mentioned feeling understood and respected in ways they hadn't experienced with other VA providers. James Mitchell wrote about how Sarah's approach had helped him regain confidence in his ability to recover, while Tommy Barnes described how her patient guidance had made the difference between giving up on therapy and achieving functional independence. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had completed his therapy under Sarah's care, wrote about how Sarah's understanding of military culture had helped her husband maintain his dignity while accepting necessary medical assistance. The letter mentioned that Sarah had somehow known to present his walking aids as tactical equipment rather than disability devices, a reframing that had made all the difference in his willingness to use them. The award ceremony took place in the VA Medical Center's main auditorium, with department heads and staff members gathered to recognize outstanding achievements in veteran care. Sarah sat in the front row with other award recipients, feeling a mixture of pride and discomfort with the public recognition. When her name was called, she walked to the podium with the same measured pace she had used during her early morning rounds, accepting the plaque and certificate with genuine appreciation, but without the emotional display that some recipients showed. Her brief acceptance speech focused on the honor of serving veterans and the importance of trauma-informed care approaches, deflecting attention from her personal achievements to the broader mission of improving veteran health services. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, coming not just from colleagues who felt obligated to show support, but from veterans in the audience who had experienced her care firsthand. Several patients had asked permission to attend the ceremony, wanting to show their appreciation for someone who had made a real difference in their recovery process. After the ceremony, as staff members and guests mingled in the reception area, Sarah found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and asking questions about her approach to veteran care. The attention was overwhelming at first, but she gradually relaxed into conversations about trauma-informed therapy techniques and the importance of understanding military culture in healthcare settings. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, The VA department director approached Sarah during the reception with a proposal that would expand her influence beyond the physical therapy department. The VA was developing a system-wide initiative to improve care for veterans with complex trauma histories, and they needed someone with both clinical expertise and lived experience to help design training programs for civilian staff. "We're looking for someone who can bridge the gap between military and civilian healthcare cultures," Dr. Walsh explained. "Your work in the PT department has demonstrated exactly the kind of innovation and understanding we need to scale across the entire medical center." The opportunity was significant, offering Sarah a chance to influence veteran care on a much broader scale while advancing her own career in directions she hadn't previously considered. The position would involve developing training curricula, consulting with other VA facilities, and potentially speaking at national conferences about best practices in veteran healthcare. Sarah asked for time to consider the offer, recognizing that accepting would require her to be even more public about her military experience and to take on responsibilities that went far beyond direct patient care. The decision would determine whether she continued focusing on individual therapeutic relationships or expanded into systemic advocacy and education roles. The choice ultimately came down to where she could have the greatest impact on veteran welfare. Her work with individual patients was deeply satisfying and clearly effective, but the opportunity to train hundreds of other healthcare providers could potentially benefit thousands of veterans across multiple facilities. After discussing the opportunity with trusted colleagues and veterans who had experienced her care, Sarah decided to accept the position. The feedback was overwhelmingly supportive, with patients and coworkers alike encouraging her to share her expertise with the broader VA system. Her transition into the new role began gradually, with Sarah spending half her time on direct patient care and half on training development and consultation activities. The balance allowed her to maintain therapeutic relationships while building the educational programs that would become her primary focus. The training modules she developed were grounded in real-world scenarios and practical communication techniques rather than abstract theoretical concepts. She included case studies based on her own patients, with their permission, to illustrate how trauma-informed approaches could improve both patient experience and treatment outcomes. One of her most effective training exercises involved role-playing scenarios where civilian staff members experienced simulated veteran perspectives on common healthcare interactions. The exercise helped providers understand how seemingly neutral medical procedures could trigger trauma responses and how small changes in communication style could dramatically improve patient cooperation and comfort. Sarah also developed orientation materials specifically for veteran employees joining civilian healthcare teams. The resources addressed common challenges around disclosure decisions, workplace culture navigation, and leveraging military experience appropriately in healthcare settings. Her own experience with concealing and eventually revealing her combat background provided valuable insights for other veterans facing similar decisions. The success of Sarah's training programs led to invitations to speak at regional and national VA conferences, where she presented research on the effectiveness of veteran-specific care approaches and shared practical strategies for implementing trauma-informed protocols in clinical settings. Her presentations were well received by audiences that included both veteran and civilian healthcare providers, policymakers, and veterans advocacy organizations. The combination of clinical expertise, lived experience, and clear communication skills made her an effective advocate for systemic improvements in veteran care. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the veterans themselves. Sarah continued to receive letters and messages from patients throughout the VA system who had benefited from care provided by staff members trained in her protocols. The messages described feeling understood, respected, and effectively treated by providers who had learned to recognize and respond appropriately to veteran trauma presentations. Tommy Barnes, who had completed his therapy and returned to school using his GI Bill benefits, sent updates about his progress and mentioned that he had recommended Sarah's approaches to other veterans struggling with medical care. James Mitchell had become an informal advocate for trauma-informed care within veteran community organizations, sharing his positive experiences and encouraging other veterans to seek treatment. The ripple effects of Sarah's work extended far beyond her direct patient relationships or even her formal training programs. Veterans who had positive healthcare experiences were more likely to continue seeking necessary medical care and to encourage other veterans to do the same, creating a multiplier effect that improved health outcomes across entire veteran communities. On a personal level, Sarah found that openly embracing her military experience in her professional life had eliminated the exhausting cognitive load of constantly managing others' perceptions and maintaining artificial boundaries between different aspects of her identity. She could draw on all of her knowledge and experience without worrying about revealing too much or seeming to claim expertise she couldn't defend. The integration of her military and civilian identities also improved her effectiveness as a healthcare provider. Understanding combat trauma from the inside allowed her to recognize subtle indicators that other providers might miss and to communicate with veterans in ways that conveyed authentic understanding rather than professional sympathy. Her colleagues had also benefited from gaining access to her full range of expertise. Marcus frequently consulted with her on complex cases and policy decisions, while Danny and other staff members had developed much more effective approaches to veteran care by learning from her insights and experience. The physical therapy department had become a model for other VA facilities seeking to improve their veteran care outcomes. Delegations from other medical centers visited regularly to observe their protocols and learn about implementing similar approaches in their own facilities. Sarah took pride in these achievements while remaining focused on the fundamental mission that had motivated her throughout her military and civilian careers, ensuring that people who had served their country received the highest quality care possible when they needed medical assistance. The tattoo that had once been hidden beneath long sleeves was now visible most days, serving as a reminder of her journey from concealment to advocacy and a symbol of the authentic integration she had achieved between her military experience and civilian healthcare career. Standing in her new office one afternoon in late spring, looking out at the parking lot where she had once walked alone before dawn to avoid her colleagues' skepticism, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed. The same building, the same mission, many of the same people, but completely different relationships and possibilities. She thought about the veterans who would benefit from the training programs she was developing and the healthcare providers who would be better equipped to serve them. She considered the policy changes that her advocacy had helped implement and the systemic improvements that were beginning to transform veteran care across the entire medical center. But mostly, she thought about the individual moments of connection and healing that had made all the struggle worthwhile. Rodriguez, learning to navigate the world with confidence, despite his visual limitations. Tommy Barnes discovering that his amputation didn't define his possibilities. James Mitchell finding hope again after years of feeling misunderstood by the healthcare system. These were the victories that mattered most to Sarah, the quiet triumphs of human resilience and professional dedication that rarely made headlines but changed lives in fundamental ways. They reminded her why she had chosen medical service in the first place and why she remained committed to veteran care, despite all the challenges and complications it entailed. Her story had become part of the institutional memory of the Riverside Veterans Affairs Medical Center, told to new employees as an example of how assumptions could blind people to the expertise in their midst, and how authentic recognition could transform both individual careers and organizational culture. But for Sarah, the most important lesson was simpler and more personal, that competence and dedication would eventually be recognized. That truth had a way of emerging when it was most needed, and that serving others with skill and compassion was its own reward, regardless of whether that service was immediately understood or appreciated. The veterans deserved nothing less than her complete commitment and expertise, and she was finally in a position to provide both without reservation or concealment. That, more than any award or recognition, represented the true success of her journey from dismissed outsider to respected advocate and leader in veteran care. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.